I'm Jun-e, as some of you know. I don't know that we all know each other here, but perhaps that will keep happening over the summer. I learned only a few days ago that I would be doing this, or that I was asked to do this. So I apologize to a few of you. You may have heard this before. This is I think probably the last time I ever did a Dharma talk. Anyway, I had very ambitious ideas, but however, as the days happened, it didn't seem really likely that I could do the amount of study and preparation that was a bit ambitious that I'd been thinking about, something that had been going on. So this is actually something that I wrote in a memoirs class in the last couple of years. And in the recent weeks or months, I'm not sure, Ajo had received this because it had been a plan. In any case, he read it in the next day or so and then emailed me that I might, in fact, use this. That really, it seemed a bit, for me, it wasn't as exciting as these other newer ideas. However, he was quite right, as usual. And so here we are, and I apologize. I know there are probably at least two people have heard this before. So I hope it's not too tedious for you. And here we go. Some of you who know me well know that I tend to talk about things in stories, and my great affection for the story. And as you also probably know, most of you, almost as far as I know, spiritual traditions have teaching stories. And certainly that happens in our tradition, this Lotus Sutra being the great, beautiful, glorious example of teaching story. And so I like to think of our life as story. I mean, that's talked about a lot, of course. We've got a novel or a few novels, perhaps, if we live a long time, and we have a trip to the store. That is a moment-to-moment story. So these are some connected stories that make a story. And hopefully the teaching in stories is often obscure. It's not obvious. It's not obvious in koans. And often the interpretation in literature certainly goes on and on. So however a story impacts us is perhaps our own learning, and how the Dharma flows through story is part of our discovery when we are listening to stories, which we do hear frequently. I also wanted to mention synchronicity. I once considered writing up a whole thing called A Synchronistic Life. A friend of mine is very fond of synchronicities, and she likes to tell me about them as though they are something discrete from other time. And this is how people talk about it. And I tell her, well, life is synchronistic. If you don't, so everything is already happening, and obviously it's all happening together and connected. And I think some of you are familiar with the notion of the net of Indra, where each point of the threads, beams, however we want to think of it, there's a faceted stone, and that faceted stone reflects all other faceted stones in the net. You can think of it as a universal net. Well, if so, then in fact everything is synchronous. Every moment to moment is connected to all those other facets. And sometimes we are going along and we don't notice this, right? We're not living in that reality. We live in, what time do we have to get to somewhere? Our life is linear. We mostly live here in front. We have to, right? That's not some bad thing. It's what we are trained to do. It's what we do. So we don't notice these intersections, these connections. And every once in a while, something jumps up that's significant, that has a lot of color perhaps, impacts in a certain way, impacts other people, that we didn't cause to happen. It happened. And hopefully we were awake enough to experience it, to realize it. And so if we think of that as the moment that we're shown something that we, in our own volition, don't create. So anyway, here we go. Enough campaigning for the story, and also to just mention that I come from a long line of storytellers. My grandparents were very much of the Southern oral tradition, that's what people did, and stories were repeated. I hope my children aren't getting too aggravated with that behavior on my part. Probably they are. Some of them are well trained enough to say, oh, you already told me that. So anyway, this is a story primarily about my stepfather, Robert McAmis. From on throughout this now, I just refer to him as my father because he raised me and was a marvelous, wonderful grandfather to my 4 children. So his name is Robert McAmis, MC, like McMullen, those Scotch-Irish people. He was a young man at the beginning of the Second World War, and I believe he was drafted. I'm not 100% sure. I could probably look up the record. Anyway, he was probably getting into the mid part of the war and probably getting close to 1944. And as you all know, the war ended in 45, so it's getting towards the end. He was trained, his battalion was trained, well, he was in the infantry. The battalion was trained in the Mojave Desert, and then they were shipped to the Aleutian Islands, which, as you know, are in the Bering Sea, specifically to an island called Attu. This island was occupied by Japanese forces, and they were embedded. They had been there. I think there was mountainous. It was somewhat mountainous, so they were obviously in a higher elevation. So this, however many battalions, and I don't know those details, were shipped to Attu. They didn't have proper clothing. It's winter, it's very cold. And I don't even know if the equipment was especially what it needed to be. So the fight began. The United States forces were, the objective was to take the island, to get the Japanese off the island, to reclaim this island. There was a lot of concern about shipping lanes, protection of the shipping lanes, and the great fear, of course, was that at some point Japanese forces would be within bombing range of the West Coast. And that wasn't so far-fetched, actually. But it was never attempted. I don't think it was ever attempted. And Attu was completely useless. There was no need to do this. I mean, the Japanese weren't doing anything. They were just there. But it wasn't a happy thing for the United States military and government that the Japanese were on any American territory. So this was what happened, and it wasn't a long battle because of the situation. So at some point, there was a major charge, and I think there was friendly fire, actually. It's a very terrible battle. And before that battle, there had been other encounters and fighting, and so American soldiers then were burial details, which meant they would bury the Japanese who had, well, their own, but certainly. So in that process of doing a burial detail, American soldiers took things from the bodies of Japanese soldiers. This is common in war. I believe it's probably happened forever in all wars. It sounds grim. It is grim. And so I don't know if my dad was actually ever a part of those burial details or if someone gave him things. So, but this was happening, and eventually there was the big battle to finally take the island. He was wounded by exploding shrapnel. When a shell explodes, then, there's those kinds of shells that have pieces of metal in them. And so he had a lot of shrapnel all over his body. None in vital organs, but various places. So they took the island. All the Japanese were killed. If they didn't die in the battle, which many did, then they committed suicide or were killed by their commanding officers, who then killed themselves. Being taken prisoner was a great shame. So then he was shipped home on a hospital ship, which was a horrific experience, overcrowded, not great medical treatment. He survived that also, and then was at Letterman Hospital in San Francisco, the large veterans hospital, where he then, well, I think there were a lot of surgeries, and some places they couldn't remove the shrapnel, it was too close to a nerve. But he then got pneumonia, which he also survived, and was shipped around a couple more times by the military for who knows what kind of reason. The war ended. I think he was discharged a little before the war ended. We moved back to Salinas, California, which is where he had been working before the war. He went back to his job. We rented a house in a great neighborhood, a pretty good neighborhood. I had a lot of people to play with. Everything seemed good. I think there's a lot of a distortion about what happened after the war, that this was all, everybody was, oh, we won the war and back to it and great prosperity and all this. It was really difficult. It was hard. It was hard for these former soldiers. So at some point in that period, and probably I was 9, I may have been 10, probably, no, I was 10. And so he started having nightmares, and there would be screaming in the night. And I don't remember if my mother talked to me about this. I do strongly think that I knew why, and I knew what was happening. And he was a large man, and so it's a very strange thing to hear someone that wasn't particularly emotional. He was a fairly stable, kind of calm person. And I don't know how long it lasted, but it gradually wore off. Just, things did get more and more normal. He did some studying on the GI Bill, and on and on. And probably towards my late adolescence, he showed me he showed me this bundle of things. And these were the objects that had been taken from the bodies of Japanese soldiers. As I say, there's I'm sure all of you experienced this. When you lose someone, you think of all the things you could have asked and didn't ask. So I don't know if he took them. I've tried to remember that exactly how he told me. I don't know. I think so. But I'm not 100% sure. I'll pass around this photograph. So obviously I was beginning to see that he was really disturbed by having ever been involved in this fighting, by knowing that he had killed people, and he thought he knew how many. Just beginning to disturb him. But I don't remember talking about it a lot after he showed it to me. So the bundle, all Japanese soldiers carried a small Japanese flag, had white gloves, had also regular gloves. So in this bundle, and then there was a large Japanese flag which had blood stains. There were pictures, there's about actually 4 or 5 pictures of beautiful women in kimonos, of children in kimonos. There was a leather case with inscription in it, written in Japanese script, of course, and bullets, and a small card about this tall, about this wide, that opened. It was embroidered on the outside, and inside was an inscription in Japanese. So this was, we'll talk about a little bit later what that was. So I'll pass this photo around. These are this is a picture that I believe he took, that I found in his things. So then I think, I don't know really how old, but as my kids grew up, he started to talk about all this more. And he also showed it to them and told them about this battle. So then when he died, it was always this kind of lurking thing in the background, what to do, what could be done with these items, what was respectful, what would be a way to honor this. And we didn't really ever come up with anything. So they kind of just were back there somewhere. So after he died, I went through everything very carefully, that was going to happen. And I said to my older son, who's named after him, Robert, I said, I think that he did something, it's gone. Maybe he buried it, maybe he burned it, but he never said anything that he was going to do. So it's just gone. Thought, okay, well, he dealt with it in whatever way was going to work for him. And then Robert, some months, I don't know how much later, because my mother was, the house was still there, my son decided to go through the attic and clean it out and just sort it all out. We hadn't been up there. Well, of course, he found it, stowed away in a corner somewhere. And now it was us. What were we going to do? What should we do? What could we do? So we talked about Robert taking it to the Japanese consulate in San Francisco. As life goes, of course, that didn't happen. And Robert just took it back to Salt Lake with him. And again, it was stowed away. He put it somewhere safe. And it just was there. And I don't even know how often it came up. But we all my kids and I, we know it's there, it's there. Then, fast forwarding to 2005, we had been here, this group had been here since 2002. 2005 was the year that 4 of us, there had been a group of 3 that did the first Jukai that was done here with Ajo. I don't know, the year or 2 before that, you think? Well, I think that it was the anniversary in 2004. Not the anniversary, but the dedication, you say? Is that right?
Yeah, 2004 was the temple dedication.
Was 2004? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in 2005, I think it started with Issei, and then I came along, and a woman named Sydney, who's in Boise right now and lives down the street, did live down the street, and Miobin, decided through that spring, I don't know the dates exactly, that we would do Jukai. We asked Ajo, plans were made to sew, and we were in quite a panic about that. The date then was finally set for April 15th of 2005. That the four, there had been one other person who had done it, just one person, but we were the second group. At the same time this was going on, Jan Bays, Chosen Bays from Great Vow, some of you may have known her, do know her, decided she wanted to do ceremonies at Hiroshima. This was the 60th anniversary of dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, and it was her 60th birthday. So as the things progressed, other priests decided to go with her, including Ajo, and along with that, she wanted us, everyone, to participate in making jisos. You all know jiso, I hope. There's some jisos around, statues. So we were doing woodblock prints on pieces of cloth. A woman named Soen, who used to be here, was I think, designing the blocks. And we had a lot of gatherings here of just coming by, getting together and making jisos. She wanted to take as many as the number of people that died at Hiroshima. I don't know if that goal was reached. So somewhere in all of this, I thought, perhaps Ajo could take this bundle back to Japan, and perhaps it would be known what could be done with it. So I talked to him about it, and he said he'd talk to his teacher, which he did, and his teacher said yes, to bring it. So then it was, so I said, all right, well, I'll see if Robert can mail it. Ajo said, no, you can't mail it. It has to be hand carried. I said, all right then, I'll fly to Salt Lake. If there's no other way, I'll do that, because we're going to do this. So as it turned out, I had, of course, invited any of my family that wanted to come to Jukai. And then Robert was able to come and brought his 3-year-old daughter, Brenna. And so after Jukai, I was going to, of course, share it with Ajo and go through all of that. So my kids are here, 2 of my sons and my daughter and 3 granddaughters are here. And we sit around before Jukai, spend an evening looking at the bundle, talking about my dad. And we had all these letters to the editor. He was from Lewiston, Idaho, and of course, people used to be in a battalion together from their hometown. So he was a bit of a hero because so many people had lost their sons in Lewiston. So we read all these old letters to the editor, talked about all this, and shared it for this last time. So we did Jukai, everyone left, and I managed to get through it and bow in all the right places and not fall down. Anyway, it was a wonderful experience. And so after that, I had a meeting with Ajo, and I brought everything in, and we sat in his office, which used to be the temple office, was his office in those days. And so he lit incense and opened the bundle and examined each item very carefully, and of course he, could read the Japanese and knew that what the inscription was in the leather case was a person's name. He also, of course, knew what the brocaded card was, which was something that all Pure Land Buddhists carry, and the inscription was Amitabha Butsu, praise to the Buddha. This is always sort of emotional. The realization, I think, that these young men were all Buddhists. And I was determined to not have any emotion. I really practiced it and said, keep it together. You don't really need to do that. But for some reason, that part of it. Okay, so they left for Japan. I don't know what time they all left, and went to Hiroshima. And of course, we didn't hear anything while they were gone. I didn't know what had happened. And I think for some reason we were having a little potluck here, maybe, well, I don't think it was for Ajo's return, but everyone was here. And so I was so anticipating, knowing, if anything, what had happened, how did it go. And when I got here and said hello to Ajo, he said, wow, have I got stories to tell you. So that was pretty good. So we got together a few days later, and so they had his home temple, as many of you know, is in Sendai. His wife's family, his wife is from Sendai. The soldiers that fought in the Aleutians, the Japanese soldiers, were from Sendai. They were from northern Japan. So that has some significance. So I'm going to pass this around. This is a photograph from the newspaper, the Sendai newspaper. And so what this is Ajo took the bundle to meet with his teacher, and this is published in the local Sendai newspaper, and with Ajo's mother-in-law and father-in-law's phone number for anyone who recognized anything to come forward, or to call if anyone recognized the name, the photographs, or anything. So, a dear friend and local artist framed that. So it turns out that an 80-year-old man called, and he recognized the name in the leather case. It was his nephew, his sister's son. Because of course, these soldiers were very young, most of them probably 18, 19 years old, and they wouldn't have yet had families, and their families were most likely gone because it had been that long. But this man was 80 years old. And so he was very moved, very happy to know about his nephew. And I think that she received a lot of phone calls, but nothing else matched up. No one ever identified anyone in the photographs. So that was the story, and it was obviously very meaningful to me, and I think to my kids. And when I was writing this, I felt as though when I wrote this, I don't know, some months ago, that it would be, I think my father would have liked this outcome. I think that it would have felt right to him. And I hope wherever in all that net of Indra these things happen, that he, if he wasn't already released, then I think he was. So I'll just read something I wrote at the end of this, and then maybe talk a little bit more about. So in the piece that I wrote, this was the closing, and this was obviously constructed differently because it was for a different situation. In great gratitude to my teacher, A.J. McMullen, his teacher who blessed the bundle, and to my son Robert for keeping the bundle safe. And gratitude especially to my father, Robert McAmis, for his courage to change, to confront his feelings towards Japanese people, and develop friendships with Japanese American war veterans, and to eventually question all war and decide that his grandsons never would go to war, even if that meant him taking them to Canada. And that was true. He talked about it. You know, as my sons got older, the Vietnam War dragged on, and there was a draft. And so that's what he was responding to. And I had watched these changes over the years, and him become a much softer person. And of course, I personally decided when I was 12 that I was a pacifist, so I never, the whole violent war thing. And I remember saying to a close friend of mine when I don't know how old my sons were, something about, well, do I have a right to, how much right do I have to really instill or attempt to instill values of nonviolence and pacifism? And she said, if you don't have a right, who does? So I thought that was a good answer. And so they weren't allowed to have guns. Sometimes they managed to get one anyway, one of them. But there wasn't a lot of that kind of stuff. They weren't allowed to watch certain violent movies. I remember I had an argument with my youngest son about the Green Berets or something. Now it probably isn't even that violent. But anyway, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the synchronistic aspects, because it wasn't until, I think I did this before here, it wasn't until then that I realized that this was, I did not, I know it's kind of unbelievable, but in all these years, I hadn't connected that this happened when I did Jukai. This happened, that it occurred, I just somehow had never, it was just like, oh well, this is what happened. And that significance of that, and it wasn't cause and effect, obviously. It was a sequence of things, of happenings. And then in preparing for this talk, this is sort of really unbelievable, in preparing for this talk, I was, I don't know, wanting to have some kind of conclusion or something like that. And I had never really seen the implications of having done it when I did Jukai. And a very, very, very strong part of Jukai that I think sometimes we can sort of have over here is the Bodhisattva vow. I mean, everybody gets kind of distracted by the rules, so-called, or not rules, but the huge, enormous, significant, powerful, lifelong commitment that we make is the Bodhisattva vow. So as I was writing this and preparing for this, I realized that this series of events happening the way they did, involving my teacher, involving his teacher, was a great, what would be the word, statement of faith. That this, if there was a need for validation for the step I had taken, well, here it was. Here it was in a series of events. I wasn't thinking at the moment that, oh, I'm looking for some validation, but I'm not a joiner. It took a long time for me to make that decision. So as I wrote this, I was somewhat overwhelmed with gratitude that I had finally had this realization after a long time. And I would always think to myself that any kind of synchronistic event that was significant was always a faith marker for me. You know, we talk about faith. It's not something we can easily define, and or how we experience it. And I suppose it's staying clear in the deep understanding that I'm not in this alone, and that I'm not it. I'm just a piece of it. And but then this really hit me. So I was grateful that I had to go back through this and see it and feel it in a much deeper way, and see that it really does express the flow of the Dharma. So I think our time is all right. I don't know. And I think there's time if people have anything to say, or questions, or comments, or anything. So thank you.
Jun-e, can you define Jukai? Because I know there are a few people here who may not know what it is.
To define what?
Can you define Jukai? Because I know there are a few people here who won't know what it is.
Well, that's when that's the precepts, and the priest or whoever it is, in this case Ajo is the preceptor, he gives the precepts, I believe is the language. So there's a 10 what are called prohibitory precepts. There are 3 before that, which are sometimes translated differently. And then, of course, ultimately the whole process is taking the Bodhisattva vow, which is the commitment to facilitate, I don't really like that word, all sentient beings to enlightenment without seeking that for oneself, agreeing to, if you're really technically, agreeing to come back and come back. And so it's really about not living for oneself, living for others. And that was actually the talk I did give about the Bodhisattva vow, because I feel as though I only recently actually got it. I mean, I thought I got it before, but I always... So anyway, I don't know if that explains it. So it's a ceremony, it's a ritual that happens here, and there's a fair amount of bowing at different moments, but we literally say yes and yes and yes, I do, I will, to each of these precepts. And Ajo, at that point, has decided on a name, and that becomes our Buddha name. And usually we know that the night before we meet the people that are going to do this, meet with them and receive their name. So it's really a guidance for walking the path, for living one's life from this perspective. So I don't know, does anyone have other questions about it? So, okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Maybe, I said, may your story bring more peace.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's, yeah.
Carolina, I actually heard you give this talk before, and I wasn't bored at all. Actually, it had a little different flavor
Yes,
this time
good.
because time has passed. So it was the story with a little different orientation, I thought, at the end. And it really is such an interesting story.
Yeah.
And so connected to the
Right.
temple.
Right.
That maybe you should give it annually.
Right. What was the last sentence you said?
Maybe you should give it annually.
Aha. We'll see, I don't know. We'll see. What was I going to say? I think there's some plan. That photograph, I told Ajo, I don't know how long it's been that my friend did that, it's to come here, and at some point, I mean, that was the plan. And I have the original, that's the original, I took a photograph. And so to be hung someplace with a simple explanation, obviously not of all this, but a simple next to it, something, written up that just has dates and a moderate explanation as to what the significance is. So I think that's going to happen eventually. It's all been a little slow. It was a little slow for me to write,
I think, and one other comment I would make is I think this story touches on so many aspects of our practice and what we work with.
Right.
And what the world is about.
Right.
And the things that we struggle with. And it has resolution. Anyway, it's a good story.
Right. And that it was in our beginning years, that this place was coming together. A lot of people had worked really hard on the building. Things were getting established, like how to do Jukai, and the people were making decisions to do that, and we did the ritual. We didn't have a lot of young people training, so Ajo was trying to teach us, and I'm sure he felt frustrated at times, to do everything that gets done. People were in the Sangha were doing it, and so it also was that fresh, exciting time that was the beginning, and it was a beautiful beginning. And when the priest had come in 2004, and his teacher, that was really a scramble. We thought we didn't know how many people would come, what to do about food, what to do about flowers, what to do about housing. There were 3 days of ceremony. There were, I don't know how many, maybe 5 other priests, and so it was marvelous. It was beautiful, and Ajo's teacher it was very profound for me to meet him. So that was just the year before. So it really felt, I think, as though we were happening. This was going to happen, and it was happening. We were doing it, and it was the real deal. So it happened in that feeling, in that atmosphere. All right then.
Jun-e, could you talk about the Dharma name that you received in Jukai?
Could I talk about it?
Yeah, the Dharma name.
Well, that's kind of another talk someday. But my name is Jun-e, and it means means straightforward wisdom. Well, when I was in there that night, if you've experienced it, it's all pretty, intense, and Ajo was young, and I was not, so I'd sometimes given him a bit of a hard time. Not really, but so I wasn't sure. I thought, I'm not sure he's going to treat this, and but we were really in the groove coming up to Jukai, so I was rather startled by my name, and I pondered it. Japanese people who look at it and can read it say that it's actually pure. Well, I much preferred straightforward because that pure was a little too much to, live up to. So I didn't do it for a long time because I have a whole history and thing with my name, Carmelita, which we won't go into. So I just wasn't, and I'd had more other names, the whole name thing. I wasn't going to add another name to this and try to teach everyone, my family and friends, this other name. And he said, oh, no, you don't have to do that. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. because I also felt it was kind of my private spiritual name. So I thought that was huge relief. I said, okay then. It was a bar to me doing Jukai. So that's my name, and I then decided to use it at the Zendo, or at the temple. And that was for very specific reasons, but that's another story, and I don't think we'll go there. So, anybody else? All right? Thank you so much. Thank you. Buddha Saranam Gacchami.
This and all our teachings are offered free of charge. If you would like to make a donation, please visit our website at buddhaeye.org and click the donate button at the top of the page. Thanks.